Welcome to the second episode of Creative Intelligence. Thank you for joining the show. In today's episode, we're going to look at the researchers who helped create modern AI, the researchers who helped make all the advances in AI that makes today's generative AI possible. Now, one might wonder why even look at the stories of the people behind AI at a time when there's so much to understand about AI itself. Now, I personally believe that you can understand a lot about a technology by looking at the stories of the people who helped create it. Because technology is not neutral. It reflects the philosophies, assumptions, and goals of its creators. These shape not only what the tool does, but how it organizes power, behavior, and adds meaning to this world. In fact, researcher Langdon Winner wrote an article called Do Artifacts Have Politics?, where he argued that technologies can embody specific forms of power and authority, and these are based on the way the creators have designed them. With that in mind, I think it's going to be interesting to look at the stories of the people who helped create modern AI. My guest for this episode is Cade Metz, who's a technology correspondent with the New York Times, where he covers artificial intelligence, robotics, and related areas. He's also the author of the book Genius Makers, which tells the stories of the researchers who believed in the idea of AI at a time when much of the world was skeptical about it. I think Cade would be a particularly interesting guest for this episode for a couple reasons. First, as a journalist, he can share a perspective on what AI means for creative folks. But second, as a journalist who writes about AI and as the author of a book where he interviewed a lot of these researchers and studied their motives and also the broader culture around AI, he is a particularly relevant guest for us to understand the stories behind modern AI. For today's episode, instead of having a conversation with Cade in a studio, I decided to invite him to have a conversation in front of a live audience. So we recorded this episode at the Wharton San Francisco campus with a live audience in front of us. So you'll sometimes hear reactions from the audience as well. This was an interesting experiment to try because I could also invite the audience to share their questions for Cade. So without further ado, let's dive into the conversation with Cade. Cade, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So I think where I want to start our conversation is the book. How did you decide that the book you wanted to write was about the engineers and the researchers behind modern AI? And I asked that because I've myself written a book on AI as well, and I was interested in communicating to lay people this idea that AI is extremely important. I wrote it in 2017. The book came out in early 2019 so the book was mostly on why does AI matter, and I had a chapter on the history of AI. But it was really interesting to see your take where the history of AI, the stories of the people who built AI was what the book was about, and it's there all over the book, and you're talking about AI through the stories of the people. And what made you approach it that way?
Well, to me, that is the way to approach any story, is whether you're writing about technology or something else entirely, you want to tell your story through people. That's what we all can relate to. That's ultimately what pulls us in and keeps us there. In this case, I got lucky. Like there was something real that was happening in the AI world, and there happened to be these incredibly fascinating people who were driving that work. And if you looked a little deeper, it turned out they had driven that work for decades. The book is really about a single idea, the idea of what's called a neural network. And this was an idea that was first proposed in the 50s. The idea was that you would have a mathematical system that could learn skills on its own. You would feed data into this system, and it would learn to do things like recognize letters, and then maybe words, and then maybe images, maybe sounds, and so on the way to things that we consider truly intelligent. Now in the 50s, that idea didn't work, but there were a handful of people who believed in that idea for decades when most of the world thought they were crazy. And there's the tension in the story, right? I mean, to me, that's one of the age-old stories. Somebody believes in something that the rest of the world does not. And if you fast forward then to that moment when I decided to write the book, which is around 2017, 18, that idea had worked. After decades of struggle, it had been sucked into the machinery of industry, and it was starting to bear fruit. So I knew I had, a good story there, but ultimately it was about some incredibly interesting people. Like the main character, Jeffrey Hinton, is one of the most interesting people I've ever met.
Yeah, we'll talk about Jeffrey Hinton in a minute. But even this, I want to start off with this point you made about these people believed in the idea of AI when a lot of people were skeptical, and in specifically the idea of building AI using neural networks. I remember when I took my first class in engineering on these kinds of topics, we never, spent much time on neural networks. Even when I was doing my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, one of the legends on campus was Herb Simon, who was a Nobel laureate in economics. He'd won the Turing Award in computer science. He had won the highest award in psychology as well. So a person who's won the highest award in all three disciplines, in three very different disciplines, you had to take his course, and I did. And interestingly, when we're talking about how to build AI, it wasn't neural networks. It wasn't the idea of creating a system that looks or is inspired by human brains. It's all these other approaches like logic or other approaches that were talked about. And so indeed, there is this theme of some of these people who stuck to what we call deep learning today, or neural nets, or other versions of it, LLMs and so on. Ultimately, they went a little bit against the tide at the time, where there was a lot of, the general view was that we are not going to get to intelligence by building neural networks.
It's true. I mean, as recently as 2008, 2009, using the word neural network in a research paper was verboten. Like, some of the top scientists would write a paper about neural networks and then do kind of a find and replace that language with something else, because they knew their paper wouldn't be accepted if they used that term. But then within a couple of years, that idea took off. And the few people on earth who believed in that idea were then immediately sucked into industry. Industry realized the power of this idea very early, meaning Google and Facebook and Microsoft.
Yeah, and you started your book with, one of these people, one of the central protagonists in your book, Jeffrey Hinton, getting sucked into industry. For me, I got hooked to the book with that opening anecdote. You started off with the story of Jeffrey Hinton, who many consider as the godfather of modern AI. He was a professor at University of Toronto, and before that, Carnegie Mellon. And you talked about how Jeffrey Hinton, who at that time did not have any commercially oriented AI startup, who decided to auction himself and fellow researchers to the tech companies. And I thought that was a fascinating story and a great way to start the book. And as someone who loves a good story, I thought that was a perfect introduction into it. I was wondering if you can, one, share that story of how Jeffrey Hinton auctioned himself and his colleagues. And also, how did you piece all that information together? Because it's a lesser known story about how he joined Google.
Particularly at the time, it was very much a lesser known story. Like, it wasn't something that anybody knew, and it surprised me when I found out about it.
Right.
Someone who was not involved in the situation mentioned it to me offhandedly during an interview. Yeah. And once I heard that this auction existed, I was determined to track it down. And as I pieced it together, knew that was the opening of the book. Like, it demonstrated what I just mentioned, right? That this idea worked, and industry immediately jumped on it. So Jeff Hinton, who was, like you said, a professor at the University of Toronto, and two of his students developed a system. It was a neural network that could recognize objects. So it could recognize common objects like flowers or dogs or cars. And it was trained in that way I described. They took images of dogs, for instance, and fed it into this neural network, and it analyzed those images, and it learned to recognize a dog. In the same way, it learned to recognize cars and flowers and other objects. The power of that technology is that researchers have been trying to build that technology, same technology, for decades by hand, right? You talked about Herb Simon and sort of the other ways of building AI. The way it used to work is you would get a bunch of engineers in a room like this, and they would try to build that image recognition system by hand. So line of code by line of code. You're never going to build that way. It just takes too long, okay? Recognizing all the various patterns that go into what a dog looks like, it's just far too complicated. But Hinton and his students built a system that could recognize those patterns on its own and then learn to recognize a dog. And they published this paper, and the reaction, even among dyed-in-the-wool AI researchers, was shock. Like, they couldn't believe that this worked. And I can't tell you how much this goes against Hinton's personality, but he seized the moment. He's not a businessman, right? He didn't take an MBA course at Wharton, okay? He's very much a researcher, very much a scientific academic. But together with these two students, he decided to auction himself off to the highest bidder. And to this day, I have not been able to find a historical precedent for this. He literally had some of the biggest companies on earth on the hook for this auction. Google, Microsoft, Baidu, which most people call the Google of China, at least here in the US, and one other company. He knew that they were all interested. He had a giant offer on the table from Baidu. They were willing to pay him and his students $12 million over 3 years to come work for them. And he turned down that offer and set up an auction. And in real time, over the course of 2 days, when he was in Lake Tahoe for an AI conference, these giant companies bid on his services. And when I first heard about this auction, all I knew was that it had happened. But as I talked to more and more people who were involved in the auction, I was able to piece it together. Not everyone had all the pieces. It was a blind auction. So if you were Microsoft, for instance, you didn't know who the other players were. You didn't know what they were bidding. But eventually I talked to everyone who was at first reluctant to talk to me, because these are giant public companies that don't want you to know what goes on. But the reality is that over the course of 2 days, these companies first bid 10 million, and then 15, and 20, and 25. Somewhere between 20 and 30, Microsoft dropped out. Then they came back in. The bidding went up to 40, 41. Microsoft dropped out again, and it went to $44 million for 3 people. And in the end, Hinton ended the auction on his own because he wanted to go work for Google and not Baidu. And so he just stopped it and took the 44, and they went to work for Google.
44 million, that's amazing. I am tempted to auction myself and my research team. But my dean is right here, so I will not do that right now. So Jeff Hinton and his contributions are pretty interesting. I remember back in the day when they broke some of the records with image recognition with their neural network. They did 2 things. One was, in terms of whatever was the best system, they beat those systems with machine learning. But secondly, they also showed that machine learning, and specifically the subclass of machine learning, which is neural networks, still have promise and still can deliver a lot of value. Now, that story was really interesting, but your book has so many interesting anecdotes. So I got curious last night, about how would I have started a book if I were writing this book? Which of these anecdotes would I choose? And as I was thinking about it, I got even more curious, and I said, I wonder if I asked ChatGPT, if I picked my favorite 10 stories and asked ChatGPT and Claude, what would these AI systems pick? And so ChatGPT,
I'm interested to hear this.
yeah. So I gave these systems about 8 to 10 stories that I thought were interesting, and you have many in there: the DeepMind funding, the DeepMind acquisition, Elon Musk funding, and then later, getting upset with OpenAI and leaving them. So many other stories in there. So ChatGPT chose the Jeffrey Hinton auction story, and specifically, here's what ChatGPT said in terms of why it would choose that story. The Jeffrey Hinton auction story, because it balances personal dedication, a key scientific breakthrough, and the beginning of the AI arms race, offering a microcosm of the themes likely to unfold in the book. So I asked the same question to Claude to see what would Claude pick. Claude also picked the Jeffrey Hinton auction story as the right story to start the book with. And the reason being, it has dramatic tension and human interest, historical significance, accessibility to a reader who isn't yet familiar with AI's history, and it creates great forward momentum for the book. So I'm curious, do you feel validated, or are you worried? Or do you get worried if AI can make the choices you're making?
None of that. I'll tell you what I think.
Okay.
I don't necessarily feel validated, but I think that this is a way of understanding the way these systems are built. Okay, like I wrote a whole book on this concept, and I tell everyone this: to understand what's happening with AI, you just need to understand this one idea, and it's the idea of a neural network, and it's the notion that it learns on its own. Okay. Technology can improve so much quicker if it works that way. In the case of ChatGPT and Claude, these are neural networks that learn from all the data on the internet, okay? That is roughly true, and you need to understand that. So every English language, for the most part, all English language text on the internet has been fed into these systems. You weed out some problematic stuff. You're going to organize it a little bit. You're not going to use some stuff that you don't want. For the most part, though, we've exhausted everything. What that means is it has learned from the book excerpt that Wired magazine posted online, which is the lead anecdote to the book, right? So it's learning that I chose to put that first. It knows that, whether it's acknowledging it or not. And this is worth remembering when chatbots pass. I don't know if there's a test for MBAs to graduate, but they're always passing these standardized tests, and people say, well,
they're trained on the test, right?
They're trained on the tests and the answers, right? It's trained in a way on my book. So you have to think, well, is it just validating me because I've already done it, right?
Okay, I'll run a cleaner experiment next time. What I'm going to do is a book that's not yet released. I'm going to first ask you, Cade.
There you go.
What would you pick? And then I'm going to ask these systems and see if it passes Cade Metz test.
There you go.
On an unreleased book.
Okay. But what I also say is that it's just the way to start that book. Once I knew that auction existed, I didn't have to think twice.
Yeah, makes sense. So you talked about Jeffrey Hinton, and we'll come back to him. I think your book spends a lot of, there's a lot of attention and time spent on Jeffrey Hinton, and also Demis Hassabis, Demis is, for those of you who don't know, the founder of DeepMind. And you talk about how Demis was a world #2 chess player for kids his age at the age of 13. He founded DeepMind. He sold it to Google for something like $650 million. Demis also won the Nobel Prize in chemistry earlier this year because of the work they did around AlphaFold, which is around protein structures and so on. They came up with AlphaGo that beat the world Go champion Lee Sedol and so on. One of the interesting things I saw you describe or mention about Demis was because he's a chess player, you presented Demis as a researcher who is not just, he's lost in this world of models, machine learning models, but he's also, because he's a chess player, he's thinking a few moves ahead. And one of my favorite stories there was the story about his meeting with Elon Musk, where Elon Musk, you mentioned, told him that Elon Musk was planning to colonize Mars because, to escape from dangers from Earth. And apparently Demis responded and said, that could work only if super intelligent AI does not follow humans to Mars. And then the game changes. And apparently that left Elon speechless and made him invest in DeepMind. And I thought that was really interesting for me. But I was wondering if you can tell us more about DeepMind itself and Demis in particular, and this idea of a person who's not your conventional model of a researcher, and you present him as somebody who's always a few moves ahead of the game in some ways.
Jeff Hinton, who we talked about earlier, knows Demis well. And what he says is that to understand Demis, you have to realize that he's not just a chess player. There was, and still is, this competition that was put on first in the early 90s. It was this Games Olympiad where you showed up at a big coliseum and you didn't just play chess as a contestant. You played chess and poker and Go and Othello, and there were 6 or 7 games that you would play, and they would basically average your performance in all these games, and then determine the winner that way. And game players would come from all over the world to compete in this competition. And what Hinton always says is, to understand Demis, you have to understand that the first 5 years that they held this competition, Demis won 4 times, and the one time he didn't win, he didn't enter. Okay, so he is a game player in the extreme. Okay, that means he's an intelligent guy. That also means he is thinking several moves ahead. It also means he's really ambitious. And after training as a computer scientist at Cambridge, he started a games company. He did that for a while. Then he went back to school for a neuroscience degree. And all of that was an effort in the long run to eventually found this AI company called DeepMind, which we created in 2010. And within 4 years, it had been acquired by Google for, you're right, $650 million. But that was just a start. So, it was in no way surprising that Demis now has a Nobel Prize. I'm sure that was on his list beginning many years ago. And by the way, Hinton, a day earlier, also won a Nobel Prize. On a Monday and a Tuesday this fall, they both won Nobels for AI, but in different fields.
Right. And interestingly, when we were talking about the auction where Jeff Hinton and his researchers were sold, you talked about Microsoft, Google, and Baidu, and DeepMind was the other bidder as well in that auction.
That's exactly right.
Now, Jeff Hinton is an interesting contrast to Demis. I mean, I haven't met him, but you've met him and you describe him in the book, and you talk about a person who doesn't seem, like the game player personality, and a person who is just committed to, building neural networks and not necessarily thinking of what's the glory coming after. So what was Jeff Hinton's motivation in all of this? And what was your read on Jeff Hinton as a contrast to Demis, two really important personalities in the development of AI?
Jeff is an academic's academic, and he really believed in that one idea, and that was his motivation. Neural networks, like I said, were eventually were originally proposed in the 50s, and they worked kind of well, to the point where the New York Times, my own publication, published a big story in 1958 about this early neural network called a perceptron. And all it could do was recognize printed letters. If you had a printed letter A that was printed exactly the same way every time, it could learn to recognize that letter A and the letter B and so on. And the creator of this system, a guy named Frank Rosenblatt, who was a Cornell psychology professor, built this thing. And there was a piece in the Times about this and how, because Rosenblatt was telling the Times reporter this, the Times just reported everything he said as if it was fact, saying that this today could recognize printed letters, tomorrow it would be images. Soon these systems would learn to talk, and they would learn to repair themselves on an assembly line and somehow fire themselves into space, and it went on and on and on. None of that happened. There was so much hype around the technology that within a few years, when it didn't take off, most of academia wrote the idea off. And by 1971, when Jeff Hinton was a graduate student at the University of Edinburgh, no one on earth believed in this idea. And that's the moment when he embraced it. And that shows you who he is, right? He believes what he's going to believe regardless of what those around him.
On that, actually, there's an interesting quote from your book that I found quite inspirational. And you were talking about why he pursued something that everyone else had given up on. And he kept doing this for a long period of time. And he said, if it's a good idea, you keep trying for 20 years. If it's a good idea, you keep trying until it works. It doesn't stop being a good idea because it doesn't work the first time you try it. And I thought that was very inspirational, even for me, as I was thinking about how sometimes I might move on from something where, in 2-3 years you don't see it, and this is like, wow, that's real commitment. And I thought that was really interesting. And interestingly, both Jeff and Demis, who we talked about, joined Google. Google acquired DeepMind and brought in Demis. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the companies behind AI.
Right.
I want to start with Google. You had a story there about how when DeepMind was being acquired by Google, they had some conditions. One of the conditions was you cannot use AI for military purposes. And the second condition they had was you need to have an AI ethics board, because they had a lot of concerns. And they had concerns around explosion of disinformation, massive job losses, universal basic income might be needed. They brought up all these concerns to Google and said, we need an AI ethics board. What happened to that board?
Well, it never really came together. And the military clause as well, that didn't exactly work. They had this clause that said Google would absolutely not use their technology for military uses. There was a big blow up in 2017 and 18 at Google because this type of technology was used in a government contract to essentially build a system that could recognize objects in drone footage, which is eventually a way of building a weapon. And what this shows is that a public company is a powerful thing, right? And it's going to do what it needs to do to make money. And a lot of those ethical concerns can fall by the wayside. I mean, it's a complicated situation. And Demis, among others, continue to raise a lot of those issues that they've raised in the past. And Jeff Hinton certainly raises those issues. He has left Google, he's officially retired. He's very concerned about the dangers and has long been concerned about military use.
Yeah, so let's stay on those concerns and the ethics issues for a moment. So you've got, on the one hand, the DeepMind folks worried about what we are building and wanting the ethics there. On the other hand, you have, somebody like Mark Zuckerberg who says these concerns are overblown. His head of AI, Jan LeCun, also says these concerns are overblown. And the person I find most interesting here is Elon Musk, who has publicly shared a lot of concerns with AI. yet has been privately investing in these systems. He was an investor in DeepMind. He was an early investor, the founding investor of OpenAI. He, of course, beyond that, is currently with XAI doing his own things in AI. And in a recent New York Times article, you said something that I thought was interesting. You said, at the heart of this competition is a brain-stretching paradox. The people who say they're most worried about AI are among the most determined to create it and enjoy its riches. They have justified their ambition with their strong belief that they alone can keep AI from endangering Earth. So I'm really curious, having talked to a lot of these people and followed these stories, what do you make of Elon Musk's ethical concerns and attempts to be at the center of AGI at the same time?
Well, first of all, it's really interesting you should quote that. You're right up there with ChatGPT and Claude. That's exactly what I was going to say. Because that's the way to understand what is going on in the industry, is that most of the people who are leading the charge towards AI carry the same attitude as Elon Musk. Okay, they all try to paint themselves in various lights, but the reality is all these people say that they're concerned about the dangers, but they are racing to build this as quickly as they can. And their justification is that because they understand the dangers, they should be the ones to build it.
Do you believe them?
Well, yes, but there's a footnote, okay? So I've known these people long enough. I've covered this field long enough. I've known Demis, for more than a decade now, and that's true of so many people in the field. I've known them since this, was, a sideshow and not kind of the center of the universe like it is now, and they've been consistent. They are worried in some ways about the dangers. And maybe they believe this thing, and some really do, about, I've got to be the one to build it because I understand, where it can go wrong. But the footnote is, all of these people are also interested in power, okay? I mean, that's what goes unsaid. And if you're at the center of the AI universe, building AI, whether it's safe or not, you've got power. And or ambition, or whatever you want to call it, right? These are ambitious people who want to succeed, and they might believe this about the dangers and saving the world from it, but also they're ambitious just like anybody else in the business world.
Yeah. So let's talk about what has happened since your book. Many things have happened in the world of AI almost every week, but certainly since your book, many things. In fact, one of the things it reminds me of, in the world of entrepreneurship and startups, one of the things I like to tell my students, especially at a place like Wharton, when I hear their ideas, it's, I rarely hear really bad or poor ideas. The harder problem is timing. Are you too early?
Right.
When it comes to AI, I feel my book, too early. I don't know how you feel about your book. Timing was good, or you wish it had come out later?
It was terrible. I told just the right story, but it was 2 years too early.
I wrote it 5 years too early too. But I'm curious about what has happened since the book. A few different things. I want to start with obviously ChatGPT, which came out. And obviously you talk about OpenAI in the book. So OpenAI was a company of relevance well before ChatGPT was released. But one of the really interesting things about this is actually I look at it from Google's perspective. We just talked about how Google acquired DeepMind. Google brought Jeff Hinton into the company. In fact, the paper that started this whole transformer revolution, attention is all you need, that paper was written by researchers at Google. And despite all of this, ultimately Google is playing defense today, with the threat of OpenAI, not just in what OpenAI is doing with ChatGPT, but also with regard to search. How do you look at that Google story, and how would you revisit that Google story, today?
a couple of things were going on there. Google was the leader in the field. I mean, that was undeniable. They had most of the talent. They had the computing power you needed to do this, and that's essential. Like, you need lots of computing power to run these neural networks. There's a particular type of chip, a GPU chip, that runs these, and you have to have these by the thousands in order to in giant data centers. Google had everything, and they were building the same type of technology that eventually became ChatGPT. But what they realized and what held them back was that these things make mistakes, that these things can be biased. Because they learn from the internet, we all know the internet is filled with garbage, they learn some garbage as well, and they do make mistakes or hallucinate, as scientists say. And Google, as a big public corporation with a reputation to protect, was reluctant to put this type of technology out because it could hurt its reputation. OpenAI didn't have those qualms, right? It's a smaller company. Before ChatGPT, no one knew what this company was, and they were in a position to put out this flawed technology. They were less worried about the consequences of that.
It's the classic thing we teach in business school, or we talk about in business school, is the incumbent becomes so risk averse because you have a reputation to defend. Even Microsoft released Microsoft Tay on Twitter, which was a Twitter chatbot, and shut it down in 24 hours because it was doing a few crazy things. OpenAI, being the lesser known company, could take those risks, but Microsoft couldn't, and that's so interesting.
That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
But there was one other thing, in that OpenAI was tiny, and they could only make so many bets, right? Google was big, and they had one group over here that was doing a chat GPT-like thing, and another that was doing something similar, and a third, and so they had all this computing power to build that, but it was divided.
Yeah.
What OpenAI did is they took all their computing power and they dedicated it to one project. And that's another thing that really pushed that technology to the point where it would open people's eyes. Because it is about throwing more and more data at these systems, and they get better and better and better. So they threw a ridiculous amount of data at it that no one else had. The irony is that the people who did that were the people who were most concerned about it being dangerous. It's just this weird way of thinking where they're so concerned about the dangers that they're looking for the dangers. So we're going to scale this thing up as quickly as we can, and take a leap into the future. And that's what happened. It was trained on more data, and but even then, no one thought that ChatGPT would have the effect that it did. OpenAI did not think anybody would care. It was just, to them, and to me, frankly, and to most everyone in the AI field, it was just another example of what everybody was building. But the general public hadn't seen that before. They hadn't seen something that worked that well. It was very easy for them to use, and it allowed them to see what had been happening in the industry for a good decade.
Yeah, I think before I move to question and answer, I want to step back a little bit away from your book to, your perspective as a writer, a journalist. First of all, I'm kind of curious, do you use AI personally?
I don't.
Why?
Well, my stock answer is that, as a writer myself, as someone who's been a writer since I was very young, the task is to get just the right words on the page, right? It's hard to get started on something until you've got that perfect first sentence. The only way to get that perfect first sentence is to get past my own neuroses, right? I'm the only person that can do that. Nothing can do that for me. you know, I think that there are a lot of things that ChatGPT can do, but it can't write the way I write, if that makes sense. So
We just need to feed it a lot of more of your writings
you
and
think
more of that
so?
stuff.
Okay. Even then, I would argue it's something a little different, but not everyone agrees with me. But I do use it if I'm writing a story about ChatGPT. I use it because I've got to understand it, but I don't use it to write my own stuff or edit my own stuff. That's not necessarily true of all journalists,
Yeah.
but it's definitely not the way I work.
One last question of mine before I go to Q&A is, you don't use it, but as you just mentioned, probably many others do.
Yeah.
And especially, a lot of artists use it too. And the question is, where does this take art and creativity in the long run? And so I'm reminded of, the story I read many years ago about how when photography was invented, a lot of people were worried about what it does to artwork and paintings, because people were worried that if you have something that realistic, then what's the point? And it ended up becoming that photography itself became a form of art. Painters started using photographs also, and furthermore, paintings also moved in a different direction, and it freed the artist from a need to be very realistic and help create impressionism and all of that stuff. Do you see a world in which AI getting into creative spaces actually also helps create new forms, takes creativity into a new different direction? Or are you more worried about, like if a junior journalist at New York Times or somebody in the art department starts to use these tools?
Well, I think there are two things there, right? So, one, I'm different than an artist, right? As a reporter, I am interested in getting the facts exactly right. I am interested not only in writing, but in gathering information. And you do that in many, many ways. You gather information from all different sources. You've got to verify that it's true once you found it. And you've got to put it into this package that someone can understand. It's a very particular thing. And the type of journalism that we do at the Times, AI can't do that. If you're a novelist, a short story writer, a visual artist, it can absolutely empower what you do and help you do certain things and help you generate ideas. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But it's not just used for that. All right? If you're a novelist and ChatGPT hallucinates and says something wrong, there's not a consequence. If I were to use ChatGPT to write an article and it gets something wrong, that's a problem. So there's two different things going on here. And not just two, there are many different things going on here. These technologies can be used in so many different ways. The problem I see is not necessarily with the type of creativity you're talking about. It's about professions. Let's take the profession of a graphic artist, where these systems can't duplicate what a seasoned graphic artist can do. And it can help them, but you still have that like veteran artist in the loop, making the decisions. Maybe they use it a little here, a little there. But ultimately, they're doing the work. Same thing with programming, okay? You need a seasoned programmer to ultimately decide what you're going to do. The problem is that these things are already starting to replace the person who's not seasoned yet, right? The person at the lower end of the spectrum who hasn't quite learned the craft. Now you got this stuff that can come in and do that job. So how do you train the next group of people to become the veterans, right?
I think that is a definite conundrum. There's been at least 7, 8 different research studies on productivity implications of generative AI. All of them consistently show that it's the lower skilled workers whose output increases a lot. For the most skilled workers, it doesn't really change things that dramatically. But then for the lower skilled workers, there is that training implication.
It's really true.
By the way, a lot of great questions here.
Great.
I want to try and cover as many of them in the limited time. So I'm going to do a rapid fire type of thing with them.
Okay.
So one of the questions here, earlier in the conversation, you highlighted conviction as a defining quality among the key figures. Are there any other shared traits or mindset that stood out to you across these innovators?
There's conviction, and then there's a willingness not to bow to peer pressure, right? And so that is an extraordinary thing with all these folks, where I can't tell you how hard it is for some people to do something when everyone else around them is saying don't do it, right? It's human nature almost. So it's not just conviction that these folks have. It is a willingness to follow what they're doing, even when everyone else is telling them, they're idiots, right? And that's not too strong a word. So and in this case, it really is, a quality where they're able to think in ways that most people don't. And one of the things that they do, and it can be hard for people like journalists who are new to the field to understand. People in this field do not live in 2024 like you and I do, okay? They live somewhere in the future. So they talk in this way as if the future has already arrived. And one of the things that has happened since the book is Jeff Hinton has left Google and come out and said publicly how dangerous he thinks this technology can be, to the point where he thinks it could destroy humanity. And when you hear him say this stuff, it sounds like tomorrow the world is going to end. And you have to adjust your way of thinking when you speak to someone like Hinton. He does not live in this time period, okay? He lives in a different time period. And what often happens, it's always so funny when something new will happen in the AI world, and one of these people who work in the field will say something, and major publications will just repeat it if it's true, but they don't realize that this person is not talking about what is happening today. They're talking about something that may happen in the future as if it's today. It's this weird quality in this world that can be powerful, right? In order to achieve something that hasn't happened yet, you've got to really believe it, right? But there's a flip side to that, where what I often tell junior reporters is what you have to remember, and this may seem obvious, but you have to remember, none of us knows what is going to happen in the future. Okay, we don't. And Jeff Hinton, has a resume in this field that matches or betters anyone on earth. That doesn't mean that he knows what's going to happen in the future.
Sure, for every Jeff Hinton, there's a Jan LeCun who's saying this is all overblown.
That's right.
On that note of ethical concerns, there's quite a few questions about those issues. One of them here is, what strategies or frameworks do you think are necessary to address the ethical implications of AI? I have done a lot of work in that space, and I'll share some thoughts, but I'm curious if there's anything you want to share as well.
Well, I think it's important to talk about the real risks of AI and separate that from the hypotheticals. Like, the real risk is hallucination. The real risk is bias in these systems. Like, that is real. When ChatGPT first came out, most people did not realize that it would just make stuff up. And I wrote an article about this, like right after it came out, and no one read it. This often happens. Maybe it's my fault, but like no one read it. And a few months later, like even inside the New York Times newsroom, people are saying this hallucination stuff is overblown. Why are you focusing on the negatives? These things are so powerful. And then this lawyer in New York files a legal brief in a case that was written by ChatGPT, and it just made up all the cases in the brief. Okay? Like that is a real risk, okay? Is that if you take these systems and you assume that what they're saying is true and you repeat it as if it's true. If you use these types of AI systems to make all sorts of decisions which are based on flawed data or biased data, researchers have talked about this for years, that these systems can be biased against women and people of color, and they can be biased in other ways because that's what the internet is, right? And we have all this flawed data that they're being trained on. And a lot of times the people choosing the data are biased, maybe subconsciously biased, right? They don't realize that they're picking data that reflects their worldview, and they're not picking data that represents everyone. So you really have to think long and hard about those things. And you at least have to, ultimately, it's about the users. The way these systems are built, they are fundamentally flawed. They're based on probabilities. That means they're going to make mistakes. And on some level, they're going to be biased. So you have to realize that when you're using them. I think that is most important. The other stuff that's hypothetical, that quickly gets complicated. What I will say is that today's systems are not dangerous. People talk about them as dangerous. They talk about them creating their own bioweapons and running cyber attacks. None of that is possible today.
I would say I've worked in a few settings where we're worried about, at the government level, what are the concerns one might have. And there are some concerns about the wrong actors non-state actors having access to AI, especially, imagine, large-scale distributed drone-based attacks that you can run. So those are, they're not existential, but meaningful terrorism threats. So there are meaningful threats around these systems. But also, I'd say that, there was this excellent book, I'm forgetting the name of that book and the author. The book proposed this thing called the AI Bill of Rights. So for the people who asked about these questions, you should check it out. The book is A Human's Guide to Machine Intelligence. It's written by Karthik Hosanagar. And that's an excellent book that actually proposes this AI Bill of Rights, which, by the way, later the Biden administration came out with the AI Bill of Rights, talking about some of these principles for AI governance. And they're mostly commonsensical things around AI governance, bias, fairness, deep fakes, those kinds of issues that you would worry about. And someone also brought up this Texas lawsuit against Character AI, which was the situation where a teenager was using the system, and unfortunately it encouraged this person to commit suicide. And so I think this is a space that needs a lot of regulation around, for example, children's use and a lot of these kinds of settings. So there's a question about, a lot of people talk about a data wall where AI models will have read the whole internet by 2026 or sooner, which is an obstacle for new data and further training. I'll just quickly take this, and then I have a question for you before we wrap up. It is true that these models are running out of text to train on. But if we look at it, most of our learning doesn't happen from text. A lot of our learning happens from other senses, everything we're perceiving, audio, video, all of that. And so that's why a lot of these models have gone in the direction of multimodal data, so that they can address the fact that we're running out of text by looking into video and other streams of data. And also they're going in other directions like reasoning and others, because if you're running out of data, then you want to think about how to grow the intelligence in other ways. One last question I want to pose to you is sort of to get your perspective as a journalist. on a world where AI is able to create a lot of content. We're probably soon entering, or we're already there entering a world where most people cannot discern fact from fiction. And I'm kind of wondering, what is the future of truth? As a journalist, what do you think about that?
That's a big question. You know, on one level, the threat of AI disinformation has been overblown. Okay, these systems, one of the things they do really well is generate disinformation. Like, that is what they're designed to do, right? They're designed to create text and images and videos and sounds that seem real but are not, right? That's what they do really, really well. And so it's natural for there to be a lot of concern that if you've got these systems generating disinformation at a scale that humans couldn't, that it would just overrun everything. But we just went through an election. This wasn't a big factor, even though we have these systems out in the world, doing their thing. What Jan LeCun, the chief AI scientist at Meta, says, and he said this like right after ChatGPT was released. So he said these things aren't dangerous, even for disinformation, because even though you can generate all this disinformation, you can't get it in front of people. Like, there are other bottlenecks. The bottlenecks are the social networks. If you create a Twitter account, it's hard to get people to look at it, right? It's hard to get people to follow it, and that's the bottleneck, right? Is you gotta somehow not only create the disinformation, but get it in front of people, and the social networks are working to weed out a lot of the disinformation on some level. But even those that don't, right? There's still a bottleneck there, because
Can I push you a little bit on that?
Yeah.
So I agree that it's still a tiny amount of the content out there,
Yeah.
but that's today.
Yeah.
I agree that a random account, it's hard for that account to push the content and be visible to a lot of people. But at the same time, we know that the kinds of information that actually get circulated on a lot of on social media tend to be not your plain old content that you and I post, but tend to be extreme views or extreme content. And so isn't there that kind of risk? And there have been examples. I agree that today it's not like influenced in the election.
Yeah.
But there are, imagine even on WhatsApp where something can spread from one person to the other. And there are examples of things spreading, creating civil unrest. Even on Twitter, there's a possibility of, especially negative information or certain kinds of extreme views, they tend to draw people in, and they tend to get reactions like retweets or likes and so on. Do you still not worry about that?
No, I do worry about that. So that's I was about to move in that direction.
Okay.
So even though like the direct power of AI disinformation, we've yet to really see it. There's this indirect power, right, where it's just sort of the threat of it, creates a problem. It creates doubt. Researchers call it the liar's dividend, right? That, if there's something that's true, well, you can say it's fake, right? We start to doubt everything, and we live in this world where it's really hard for people to tell what is real from what is not. And on the flip side of this, you have people pointing to things that are true and saying it's not true, right? Or pointing to opinion, and saying it's fact. And so it plays into this larger thing that is going on in our world, where it's harder for people to tell the difference between what's real and what's not. Because some people are, actively muddying the waters, and AI is definitely part of that, right?
I'm tempted to sneak in one last question, even though I said the previous one was the last one, Cade. Because I saw a lot of questions that were around fear, ethics concerns. you spend a lot of time talking to the people who are shaping the space, talking to also looking at and reporting on the companies that are shaping the space. Ultimately, where do you stand? Because your book tends to have a neutral perspective. You're investigating, you're reporting, but it's not an editorial. I don't know where you stand. Having followed this space, having reported on these stories from different companies, having followed these people, having followed a Jeff Hinton who's changed his views and become worried, or a Jan LeCun who's actually still very optimistic, where do you stand today in terms of ultimately you look at AI and do you have a rosy, optimistic future in mind, or do you have the concerns that I see emerge in some of the questions at least?
Got it. You may or may not be satisfied by this answer, but my job is not to have an opinion. Okay, and honestly, my job, and I really believe in this, is to take in all this information and synthesize it in a way that can give the average person the best view of what is happening. Okay, so Hinton's going to tell me one thing. LeCun, his good friend going back decades, is going to say something different. And they're both worth listening to. And you have to convey that dichotomy to the world, right? It goes back to the previous question. Like we live in this world where it's so hard to tell what is happening, right? And even in the mainstream press with this AI stuff, people will just repeat, what a lot of these researchers say, and it sounds like we're about to have like sentient robots walk in here and maybe kill us all. The reality is something different, and I just think it's so important to get at the truth. That's what I really believe in, and try to get that balance right.
Got it. Well, my job involves having an opinion, so I'll share mine for what it's worth. I actually net out as an optimist. I actually believe that there's going to be a lot of pain along the way, whether it's with regard to jobs or some of these other issues. But ultimately, this is a technology that can free us from a lot of the grunt work we do, actually allow us to move up the Maslow's hierarchy. And if you look at the Maslow's hierarchy, as your basic needs are taken care of, you're really moving towards consciousness, about understanding and connecting, empathy and creativity. And I feel like it could really be a great tool for us to move in that direction, freeing us up, maybe even taking us from a 5-day work week to a 4-day, 3-day work week and so on. But that really requires us to make collectively lots of the right design choices, making sure the value that gets created gets shared equally and so on. So I'm an optimist, but it does mean that there's a lot of work for us to do, including reskilling millions of people along the way. So I'll end this discussion on that optimistic, positive note. But I really appreciate Cade for taking the time to come here, share his perspective, and also introducing us to all these characters that helped shape modern AI as we see it. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, that was an interesting conversation. I have 2 interesting takeaways from this episode. The first was the conversation about how some of the people who helped create modern AI have over time started to become some of the big skeptics, or at least some of the folks who are worried about AI's ramifications and implications for society in general. Geoffrey Hinton, for example, both spent decades helping create modern AI, but today is one of the folks who is extremely concerned about its implications for society. Demis Hassabis as well helped drive a lot of the progress, but when his company DeepMind was acquired by AI, he wanted to have certain governance structures in place to make sure AI is safe. The other aspect that was interesting for me was Cade's observation that some of the people who say they're most worried about AI are also among the most determined to help create it and also enjoy its riches, as he put it. And they have justified their ambition with this belief that they alone can help keep AI from endangering Earth. And that's a really interesting paradox right there. So there's a lot for us to think about here, and many themes that we will explore in the coming episodes. As always, I look forward to your comments. Please feel free to connect with us on social media. You can leave your comments on this platform or share your reactions and comments on LinkedIn or Twitter directly with me. I'm Karthik Hosanagar. This is Creative Intelligence. See you next time.